Hello and welcome to the BS and Beer Show. BS stands for Building Science. We've been doing this for a while, so hopefully you've caught one of the shows before. Tonight we're going to talk about new developments in masonry heaters. It was super popular the last time we talked about masonry heaters and wood-fired heat, so I'm really excited about tonight talking about this and how it applies to low-load homes. I'm Emily Mottram, architect here in Maine. I'm totally going to get roasted for this, but I'm breaking all my gluten rules and having a seasonal beer, right? Okay. I'm not the person that goes out and buys the, like pumpkin spice lattes, but I do like a seasonal beer. So I'm breaking all the rules. They're going to roast me in the chat, I'm sure. BS and Beer is an independent grassroots movement brought to you by our volunteers and our hosts every week. Well, not weekly, every month now. So they willingly volunteer their time to bring building science to you. So we want to say thank you to them. We want to encourage you to start your own group. Shout out to the new group that's starting in BC, Canada. Please let us know if you started your own group and where you're at and when you meet. We'd love to put that up on the website so other people know how to find you and connect and grow your groups. We want to thank our media partners, Green Building Advisor and Fine Home Building, for helping us make this happen every month. So I think that's all the news from me. Travis, a couple of announcements.
I do have a couple of announcements. I'm Travis Brungard in Prairie Village, Kansas. I'm drinking water tonight because I am not in peak performance health and I need to be ready to drink more beer later. But that being said, I will remind you all that you can find the chat box icon at the bottom of your screen, and that's where you want to post your comments and questions, is in that chat box. Be sure that when you do, you click all panelists and attendees or everyone. Otherwise, Zoom wants to revert back to just panelists only, which means only we can see your comments, and then you miss out on all the fun of exchanging with everyone. So be sure you're checking all panelists and attendees or everyone. Fine Home Building sends out Zoom reminders each month, and if you want to receive those as well as other information, you can join our mailing list at thebsnbeershow.com. You can check out the BS and Beer post on the Green Building Advisor website as well. Video of tonight's recording will be shown on the Green Building Advisor website, where all past shows can be found, and also at YouTube through a link at thebsnbeershow.com. With that, how about to you, Mike, with the special announcements?
The special announcements. Thank you, Travis. I'm Mike Maines in Maine. If you're going to roast Emily for pumpkin spice, you'll really roast me for Banded Brewing. Yeah, you can't see it. Mango Sorbet IPA. It's actually really good. Yeah, it's actually really good. I am on a beer drinking break, so also breaking my diet rules, but it's worth it for a mango sorbet beer. My special announcement is I want to congratulate Travis and company for selling out their excellent Midwest Building Science Symposium. All four of us, Emily, Ben, and I were in Kansas City for that a couple of weeks ago, and it was really just a really special occasion. I learned a lot, got to see old friends, got to meet people I had only met online, and it was 2.5 days of nonstop fun and a lot of excellent food and maybe a little bit of drinking. There are still some slots available for the Southeast Building Science Symposium coming right up next week, October 12th and 13th in Chattanooga. We'll put a link in the chat box, but it's not too late to sign up for that. Definitely will be worthwhile. And registration has opened for the Texas Building Science Symposium, November 9th and 10th, again, with mostly the same characters involved. And thanks to the sponsors, the registration fee is really a bargain. So I recommend signing up while you can. And with that, I will turn it over to Ben for guest introductions.
Okay, Ben Bogey here in Connecticut. This evening I'm drinking a Schneider Weiss Aventis Weizen Doppelbock. It was what was cold and in the refrigerator. So here we go. This evening I have the pleasure to introduce our guests, and we'll start right off first with Albie Barden. Albie is a designer and builder of masonry heaters, cookers, and bake ovens with over 40 years of experience, as well as the inventor and manufacturer of the Albie Core masonry heater core kit system. He lives in Central Maine and is a co-founder of the Maine Organic Farmers and Gardeners Association Common Ground Fair, where I just was a week or so ago, enjoying myself, which was just held for the 46th year, as well as the Kneading Conference, a celebration of grain, and author of the book Finnish Fireplaces, Heart of the Home. Thank you for joining us, Albie. What are you drinking this evening? And did I miss anything?
You said enough. I had a client who in Maine, somebody that builds a foundation and lives in the foundation, hoping for the future. We call them a groundhog. And I have a client that lived in his foundation for 25 years with a wood stove, dreaming of the day that he could retire from the paper mill in Skowhegan and use his savings to have a second floor and a third floor and a masonry heater. And he lives on the Kennebec River, about 20 miles north of me. His name is Bobby Jakes, a good friend. And we built him a custom-made split-faced soapstone heater with heated benches. And his carpentry crew, as well as Bobby, were pretty serious about relaxation starting at noon. And at the end of the day, they always had plenty of Guinness to drink. So I'm drinking a Guinness tonight in celebration of Bobby and the tradition of people waiting a long time to realize their dreams.
Fine
to that.
beverage and a fine story. Thank you, sir. Our other guest presenter this evening is Rod Zander. Rod owns New England Hearth and Soapstone in Goshen, Connecticut. He has been designing and building masonry heaters since 1986. Rod started out as a cabinet maker and a woodworker. After building a masonry heater for his own home, he was intrigued and traveled extensively to learn everything he could about them. Among many other distinctions, Rod is a past chair of the Masonry Heater Task Group of ASTM, the American Society for Testing and Materials. Rod is going to give us an overview of masonry heaters this evening, and we're looking forward to that. Rod, did I miss anything, sir? And what are you drinking?
Well, you missed, I'm sure, a lot, but it will be irrelevant in the course of the evening. I'm drinking Goshen well water.
Fine choice. All right. With that, I think we can go ahead and kick it off with your presentation, if you wouldn't mind, Rod, and educate us a little bit about masonry heaters.
Okay. I've got a PowerPoint, and the host needs to allow me to do that.
1 second. I thought I did, but oh, you're right. Here you go. Now you can. I fixed it.
Do I need to do it again?
If you
There we
hit
go.
screen share again, it should go this time.
And we'll do screen 2. Share.
All right.
So this is a Swedish cockaloon. It's a 5-channel stove, so the fire burns up in the center. It splits in two, and the exhaust comes down the 2 front corners, then back up the 2 back corners, and out the top or the back. They're rectangular, circular stoves, and many different shapes and sizes and colors. When they're you can get antique ones as well. This is a Gabrielle kit stove. It's very, very efficient. It's like 93% efficient.
You can see at the top of that one, a damper and a cleanout plug.
Yep, the brass cleanout plug, and you've got the damper handle, which closes off the exhaust, reducing the heat loss up the chimney when the fire is burning. Typically, all masonry heaters are burned in batches, so that you'll burn, 15 to 35 pounds of wood at a time. The fire burns out in an hour and a half, and the heat is then stored in the masonry and tile, and then slowly released for 12 to 24 hours. In that process, there's virtually no smoke and no creosote as long as you have dry wood. And you can burn pine or softwood or hardwood. You do want it to be split about a 4-inch cross section so that it's a more uniform fuel pile. Wood actually does not burn. You have to gasify the wood first. And so basically all masonry heaters are some form of a gasification system. And when I first started, everyone would talk about time, temperature, and turbulence, but there was no understanding that I could find here in the United States or North America of how you can actually utilize that to get an efficient stove. And we can talk about that further when we talk about calculated stoves and what Austria and Germany do. There's antique stoves. These are all different versions of stoves that were built. Those were built or made, 150, 200 years ago or more. I have purchased tile stoves. Basically, all you're getting are the external tiles, and you're then rebuilding the stove with new fire brick inside and new technology. So you can have an old style stove that has 21st century technology in it and emissions and efficiency. I built a masonry heater kit that was tested in the EPA lab, and it had the lowest emissions that the lab had ever seen. It has a relatively thin skin. It's 1.25 inch soapstone here, and then modular blocks for the firebox and the heat exchange system. Part of what this firebox has is air injection, so that you have air being injected around 360 degrees around the firebox in the upper section, so that you're getting good turbulence and residence time in it. And you also have an insulated ceramic insulation blanket over the top of the firebox, which reflects the heat back down onto the fire, which allows it to gasify. Tuulikivi is the soapstone company in Finland, and they've been doing soapstone heaters for many years. They're all kit forms at this point. They also do custom stoves, but going back several centuries, they also have a catalog of old antique stoves that they made that are very different from these rectilinear stoves. Gabriel Swedish tile stoves. They have units that look like the antique ones as well as very modern ones. Gutbrod is a German tile company that also has kits for the firebox and heat exchange system. They can be any shape, size you can imagine, and with different features, with benches and bake ovens and most of them are top vented. Sommerhuber is another tile company in Austria. There's many of the companies now make small stoves, like you see in the center lower section. They found that with the well-insulated houses that are smaller, that the traditional Kachelofen means tile oven, that they were too large for modern homes. So they made Kleinkachelofen, which are small tile stoves. And every company basically has a version of that. They can be rectangular or cylindrical. Some of them are short and squat, and some of them are tall and small footprint. The Austrian Tile Stove Association, which is the Kachelofen Verband, has a computer program which allows one to take the information of what you want the stove to produce in heat, and you enter in different parameters of elevation and how often it's fueled, gives you the fuel size that you would have for that, and then the firebox size based upon the chimney, because every stove that could, or the stoves that look like they're the same, if they're in a different elevation or in a different house, the internal combustion chambers and the flue paths would be very different. These are some custom masonry heaters out of Soapstone that I've fabricated over the years. This is a Soapstone masonry heater as well as an open Rumford fireplace, all out of Soapstone with granite boulders embedded in the chimney. There's also, you can't see it, but there are several granite benches as well. The house that this was built, they assumed that the masonry heater would be the backup to their geothermal system. And they find that the geothermal is now the backup to their masonry heater. Another Soapstone masonry heater. This stove, the tall white ceramic stove, it's 12.5 feet tall. The tiles are basically the full width of that, which are about 4 feet wide, and they're 1.5 feet tall. And there's also benches on both sides. This is a custom designed internal. It's a Brunner firebox with hand-built flue channels. This is a custom-built handmade ceramic tiles with the channels are probably 35 feet long in it before it goes into the chimney. All of these stoves, when you clean them, you get a little bit of soot and fly ash like out of an oil furnace. There's no creosote. You can get creosote if you burn wet wood or if you try to close the stove down and restrict the amount of air coming into it. This is a stove that I built here in Litchfield, which is right near me, and it's a renovation where the cylindrical stove is. There was an open brick fireplace, which was all removed and new foundation built, and then custom handmade tiles for this as well. You can see the drawing from the tile maker as the initial design. These are some stoves that I've built with brick and stucco and soapstone. I enjoy using different textures and colors and in the design and function of the stove. Different bake ovens. This stove here was built actually in Goshen. There was an original chimney and kitchen system, with an open fireplace in kitchen and in the dining room, and also in the bedroom above. We removed the entire masonry chimney, reused part of the stone foundation for the stove or from the fireplace, and then built the combination bake oven on one side with a fireplace on the other, and with a wooden bench. There's additional bake ovens. This is actually on the Cape. And there's my information if people have questions or interest. And that's it.
Thank you, sir.
Somewhere on your screen it says stop share.
Well, that's what I'm looking for.
Yeah, probably a red button at the top of the screen,
I
but it
show
tends to be,
taskbar. There, here we go. I get, nope, that's the wrong one. Display settings and slideshow. There we go.
all right, we're back.
Sorry, you saw me waving. I'm on mute. I figured it out. I can stop sharing for you. So
Okay, well, you helped me figure out what I needed to do. So
awesome.
thank you.
No problem. That was great. I'm now like, ooh, how many of these can I fit in one space? Gotta have them all.
Yeah. We had a few questions, but I think just can one of you summarize like just what's the essential difference or differences between masonry heaters, a wood stove, and a fireplace? Like they all burn wood, they all have chimneys. What's the difference?
I can speak to a couple of that. I was going to suggest that people might want to have a pencil and a pad of paper. I sometimes find that simple images communicate a lot more than a lot of language. And I'm going to be inclined to tell stories versus trying to get too technical. But in any case, one of the things I thought about was in answer to your question, what is the difference? Maybe you can see this. Is that clear?
Not really. Can you get a little closer to the screen, maybe? Up a little. There you go.
All right.
Okay, one square versus a whole bunch of squares.
So imagine a 600-pound wood stove, which is a pretty big wood stove, and next to it, a 6,000-pound masonry heaters. So we're talking about a battery. And this is what this really is. We're talking about a battery that might be 10 times heavier than a typical stove. So as Rod said in his presentation, you get a charge that lasts an hour and a half or so, but you get the battery giving off heat for 10 or 12 hours, sometimes 24 hours. And it's a fundamental difference between a system that tends to go up and down and up and down in terms of its heating exterior temperatures, which are often quite hot, versus something that's kind of steady state, slowly declining over the period until you fire it up again, and then it's back at that slow thing. So one of the fundamental differences between a masonry heater and a wood stove is that they're not temperamental. You're dealing with a huge mass, and once it comes online, it's kind of present in your space. People like Martin Luther, there's a picture or a painting of him in his studio in Germany or wherever he was with his Kachelofen next to him. And he regarded it with great esteem, and I'm sure it gave him great comfort. So that's one difference, is that they are a very bigger battery. And that's going to give you a very different performance in terms of quality of heat. The surface temperatures on a typical heater, in my experience, are running under 200 degrees. It might be more than 200 if it's a big soapstone heater, it's been pushed hard, but it's typically under 200. So it's not a lot more heat than you feel off of a cast iron radiator or a baseboard radiation. It's a very gentle, almost background heat. I can remember building a heater in a home that consisted of a cook stove, a heater, a bake oven in the cook stove, a water jacket that heated an 80-gallon hot water tank upstairs, a heated bench, a wall of masonry that heated the bathroom. And when you walked into that house, you felt like you were standing outside on a winter day without any wind in the sunshine. It was crisp, it was clear. There were no moving air currents, there was no dust. It just felt this amazing level of comfort. And that's what the users of these always report. It's a different quality of feeling in the air and in the room. Wherever you can see the heater, you are experiencing the radiant energy of the heater. So that's kind of a second difference. It's not burning the air in any way. It's not creating dryness. Now onto a fireplace. A fireplace, we all in our heart, I think, relate to the idea of fire and wanting to be connected to fire. But the traditional open fireplace probably lost as much or more heat up the chimney as it gave. And it really had almost no storage capability. So while people continue to build fireplaces and often put them in the wrong place, namely on the outside of the house, what they're basically buying is the beauty of the fire, and then they're going to need a different heat source to heat the house. If you build a masonry heater and put it in the center of the house, you can get a fire view and you can get the quality of heat that lasts for 12 or 24 hours. And you don't need, as Rod said, this family put in a serious different heating system, regarded the masonry heater as the backup, and suddenly we're surprised to learn that the masonry heater was carrying the house and the other thing was the backup. So we always think of it in my building, I'm trying to build something for somebody as a primary heat source, not as a pleasant, occasionally used product. The average house that has a fireplace, unless people are very wealthy or maybe have servants bringing in firewood or are incredibly passionate about fire, will have a fireplace, an open fireplace that's almost never used after the first year or so. It'll be used for a grand occasion, but otherwise it's a placeholder and something else will be doing the heating work. But in the case of a masonry heater, once that kicks on in the fall, you're going to be lighting it once a day or twice a day, and it's going to be the center of what you're doing with your heat, and it's going to be giving you back the support you're asking for throughout the day and night. We lit our big Soapstone cook stove heater in our kitchen yesterday for the first time this year. And I got up at 4:30 this morning and it was still warm. And then I got up at 6 and it was still warm. And today, because it was a warm day, we didn't fire it again. But we're already now getting excited about shifting our cooking to that surface and understanding that every morning when we get up and go into that part of the house, it's going to be cozy from that heater. So those are three differences. Also, wood stoves, I was telling my wife, Michelle, about the shakers. We all know about the shakers and their austere lifestyle. They would have metal stoves, sometimes with a second chamber on top of them. And they would fire them and they would have them at one end of a room. And then they would have a stovepipe that would go up to the ceiling. And then they would run a horizontal stovepipe hung by wires across the length of the room and go out the other end of the building. That was all about capturing as much radiant heat off of that thin metal as they could. And they understood that if they needed to take that apart and clean it, they were going to have to do that. We can't do that today legally. But metal wood stoves realized that what we were doing was making a stove airtight and then pretty much eliminating what Rod was talking about, the gas burning function of the wood stove. We were choking it off so that we could get a long, quote, burn, which was really a long kind of charcoal char. And during that time of 8 hours or so, what we were doing was producing massive quantities of unburned gases, which were then, to the degree that they cooled in the chimney or in the stove or the stovepipe, they were producing creosote in addition to pollution. When the EPA stepped in and said, you got to fix this, guys, the basic fix, as I understand it, was twofold. They stopped allowing the top of the stoves to be radiant, high radiant surfaces. They said, you got to add insulation in the top of that stove, and that will raise the temperature in the top of the stove So these gases that Rod are talking about that are liberated, because the gases want to come off and they're buoyant, they want to get the hell out of there. And so by putting that insulation on the top of the stove, suddenly we had a hotter surface. But all the air was traditionally coming in at the bottom. And so they said the second change that has to happen is we have to bring air in at the top. So now the average code approved wood stove, and you can't make a stove unless it meets the emissions requirements, that stove is going to have insulation in the ceiling and an air delivery system in the ceiling of preheated oxygen that jets the air into the gas flow so that you get good gas combustion. And there are some very nice stoves out there, but they're not going to give you the same heat or what I'm going to call the quality of heat of a masonry heater. It's still going to be different, but they're all potentially capable of burning so much cleaner than anything we did years and years ago. Masonry heaters have always burned relatively clean. As Rod pointed out when he started, there wasn't much information on them. There was just this tradition, and you had to research and basically go to Europe to figure out what was going on, which he did and I did. And it turns out that the same thing that the wood stove people figured out, masonry heater people have figured out as well, that you need a hot environment, you need good mixing of gases, and you need a way to get the air, the oxygen, to the fire in order for the fire to be happy. And I wanted to say it right at the beginning. One of the biggest things that a user of a wood stove or a masonry heater can do to understand the fundamental principles of how to live with wood heat is to understand that the fire is alive. The fire is a spirit, the fire is an energy, the fire is a personality, and it can get very angry if it's not taken care of and punish us with creosote and smoke and pollution, or if we treat it with respect as a good friend and an ally, as a sacred being, then lo and behold, the fire can be happy, and then we can be happy, and the result is a smoke-free environment and an incredible heat source, an incredible health source, and a happy bunch of people living around it. So I think when we think about fire, I grew up as a Boy Scout and we learned how to make fire and we learned how to work with fire, but nobody said to us, hey, Albie, this fire has spirit. And if you can make the fire happy, then you'll be on the right page. So over the years, it's been a lesson in learning how to honor the spirit of the fire and keep the fire happy. It's an amazing thing to ask fire to go uphill. We all think fire is going to go uphill. That's what it does when we light it outside. And the big change that happened when King Gustav of Sweden said, holy cow, we're running out of fuel. We have to do something about this. And he had a national competition and two engineers stepped forward and they came up with this design that Rod described. And they said, we can make the fire go up, the smoke can go up, but then if we treat this correctly, if we treat this fire with respect, we can actually, instead of just letting it go up and out like an open fireplace, we can ask it to come back down. And when it comes back down, guess what? Then it's giving its heat to the sponge of the mass before it leaves the house. And whether it's a 5-tube design, up the center and down the sides, which is the Finnish design, or up the center, down the front corners and up the back corners, which is the Swedish design, both of those systems are called contraflows, and both of them capture that surplus heat after the burn has happened. In Austria, there's a different system that he can describe in more detail, and in Russia, there are other systems that can be described. But all of them have figured out how to persuade the fire to be happy and to give off the energy of the burned gases before they escape. If you take a sink and turn the water on, and you put a big boat sponge in your sink, and you put the water on quite strongly, most of the water is going to go down the drain. That's what happens in an open fireplace. You've got a big fire, it's pretty to look at, and most of the water, most of the fire is going most of the heat is going up the chimney. But if you can somehow take that same volume of water and let it all get into a bigger and bigger sponge, it doesn't go down the drain. A little bit goes down the drain, but most of it stays in the sink, which is the house. So that's an answer, a long answer to that question. I want to tell one more story and then I'll shut up for a minute. I went to my daughter's house this morning. She's about 20 minutes away, and we did the first fire in her new masonry heater. It was a 4-tier heater that an old friend of ours, Glenn Overick, who was president of the MHA, Masonry Heater Association, designed years ago. It was a little heater, and there was a surplus of them that they got rid of. And so I bought a second one. And so we took a 4-tier heater, each about 1 foot tall per tier, and we made it into a 6-tier heater. And then we put a soapstone chimney behind it, which we transitioned to a metal bestis chimney. And so she was very excited and nervous about how do we start this thing? Because remember, we're asking Mr. Smoke not to just go straight up and out. There's no bypass in this system. We're asking him to go all the way up and all the way down in a cold system. So I ran around to the back where the chimney was, and we opened a soot plug there, which I had built into it. And I put a single sheet of newspaper and lit the newspaper. And I said, see how this draft is going up the chimney? And then I put a second sheet rolled up like a little torch, and I lit that. And I said, let's try this. And then we closed the plug. We had a little baby fire set with a teepee in the front of the unit. And we lit that with a propane torch and closed the door, and boom, off it went. Not a whiff of smoke in the whole process. First fire, and then we just kept some little pieces of kindling going for the next hour or two to dry things out. But it was a very exciting moment for something that's literally been years in the making, as she waited and waited and waited for this last member of the family to have her own masonry heater. So that was an exciting day today.
So my understanding of the function of a masonry heater is to give the fire the best possible circumstances for it to release as much energy as possible. And then we give it a lot of mass to store that energy and release it slowly.
You know, Rod was talking about I don't know, he was talking about a lot of things, but he showed a firebox and he said, this firebox has secondary air coming in over the fire. So imagine the wood crib only going to a certain height. And above that crib, he's got a slot of some kind, a horizontal slot that's bringing in preheated combustion air. And that's all about this gasification. So at that point, that's where the gas burning starts. Many people now are buying these very lightweight stainless steel fire pits outside. What are they called? What's the name of them? They look like the inside of your washing machine, the stainless steel drum in your washing machine dryer. Solo. So look up Solo, because it's a really good lesson in understanding clean combustion. This thing you can pick up on one hand like a snare drum. But if you look at it, it's two nested washing machine stainless steel drums with a solid bottom. And when you look at it, there's a ring on the bottom of round holes. Walmart or one of the hardware stores has figured out how they can steal the patent, and in their version, which is cheaper, is now square holes. So at the bottom of this is a circle of square holes or round holes. And that delivers air into the bottom of this stainless steel lightweight chamber with zero mass. And then that air is preheated and is some of it is introduced at the bottom. And then when you look at the top of that thing, which is about 2 feet tall and 2 feet in diameter, there's another ring of holes. And that ring of holes is on the inside, not on the outside. So what they've done is they've introduced combustion air at the bottom, preheated it, and then that whole circle around the top is a jet of preheated oxygen that's coming at the fire where the gases are normally producing smoke in the average outdoor fire pit. And so once you get that little unit underway, that gasification is working beautifully, and it's a pretty much smoke-free system, but it embraces the same principles that are going on in a masonry heater. What it lacks is a sponge. It's a great combustion system, but all the heat is being thrown away, except if you're barbecuing something. So that's going on, and most of the technology that's been developed recently has figured out a way to introduce air over the load of fire, because gases, as they're released, represent more than 50% of the fuel capability, the heating capability in wood. And most of that is thrown away when the gases aren't burned, and it finds its way out as pollution. But if they're burned, then you get this high efficiency. And in the case of masonry heaters, a way to store it and give it back gently and evenly to the house.
With that sponge idea in mind, I mean that's the specific heat capacity of the materials. Is soapstone, like I noticed you both talk about soapstone a lot. Is the specific heat capacity of soapstone significantly more or better, higher than other materials, or why is soapstone used so often?
Soapstone is a natural refractory material, so you can heat it without it exploding.
Oh,
There
okay.
is not molecular water in it that turns to steam when it's heated. It also has a high heating capacity, so it's able to store more heat and then release it for a long period of time. It isn't a magic thing. Ceramic tile does the same thing. Fire brick, common brick do the same thing. Clay bricks that have been fired are going to be more stable than a granite or other natural stone that has a potential to spall or crack or explode. The other thing that happens with what Albie was talking about with the combustion is you really need to know what the chimney is doing, because the chimney is actually the driver of what creates the draft. So that if you have, and you can identify the insulation values of the chimney, the surface restrictions of it, and also the elevation of the house, you then know what the draft capabilities are being produced by a certain amount of fuel that's being burned, and you can be assured when it's properly balanced that you will have a no smoke situation coming into the house.
Yeah, the soapstone, there's a great video that I think you can find a link. I went to Europe, as did Rod, several times, and on my first trip in the late 70s with a baby on my back in the middle of the winter, with a wife that was going along for the deal, supporting the whole idea of let's find out what this is all about. We went to Switzerland, and we stayed with a man in what was called an Ein house, a timber frame house, with half of the building was the barn with a center aisle down it, and half of it was a very modest lodging with a cook stove, a wood-fired cook stove made out of ceramic, and a bake oven in the kitchen that extended into the living room. So the mass of the bake oven was heating the living room, and then it was there were convection registers in the ceiling that let the heat go up into the upstairs rooms, and we stayed as guests in those rooms. But the young man that hosted us was a organic farming extension agent, and he gave me a little book that was a reprint from a German film that had been made. And it turns out that Switzerland had its own unique small, I mean, Switzerland's already small, but it had its own soapstone deposit. And this little book showed a man my age or slightly older, very, very thin, wearing like white blue jeans and a white cap. And these were just black and white images from the from the film that the Germans had made of him going up into the mountains to some quarry, hauling the stone up by hand, dragging it down with a rope, literally letting the weight of the stone pull him down the mountain. And then his backyard with only hand tools, hand saws and hand chisels. You see this guy making a handmade solid soapstone stove, likely a wedding gift for a young couple, because at the very end, there are initials on each side and a date. And for 30 years, I chased that book, knowing that there was a movie out there someplace. And I finally found a friend in Rhode Island who's a professor at Johnson in Wales, who's Swiss born, and his dad still lives in Switzerland. And they were able to finally track down the people that had a museum that had this film. And they allowed us to buy the rights, not to sell it, but to show it. And so if people want to chase this down and do a little squirrely looking, we now have that film about the Swiss soapstone stove maker. And it's an inspirational film. It's black and white, silent, shows this artisan craftsman starting from scratch and building this amazing piece of work at the end of his career. It's a real inspiration for anybody that wants to see it. And you can get it by just going to our website, which is under Albie Barden. So soapstone has always been recognized as this remarkable, friendly to fire material. Soapstone, pipestone, and meerschaum are three related items that hold fire. And cultures all over the world have understood this. The Inuit have understood it, and the Afghans have understood it. And wherever soapstone occurs, people use it related to fire. But if you take a little time and look up the specific heat of soapstone, it's in a class of its own. It does have remarkable qualities. So it's workable, it's beautiful, it's polishable, it's sawable, it's chiselable, and it holds an amazing amount of heat. Having said all of that, while I brought Thule Kiwi to North America 30-something years ago, I built mostly brick and stone heaters. And only more recently have I reconnected with Thule Kiwi when one of the original dealers that I set up in Maine retired. And I said, well, I'll do that. And so we're now doing Thule Kiwi again. And Rod was involved in Thule Kiwi. And he's made all of these beautiful custom-made soapstone heaters, which are breathtaking, gorgeous, and obviously functional. So soapstone is a remarkable thing, but don't think that if you don't like it, or you want to build out of brick or granite or slate or river stone, don't think that you can't do that and be happy. I don't have any unhappy people with alternate products. And we've mostly done brick and stone heaters through our career. So it is a remarkable material. And there is in this country, by the way, not this country, but in this continent, the band of the Appalachian Mountains has soapstone in it, stretching all the way from Georgia up through into Quebec. And there is a functional quarry. The largest quarry in North America is in Quebec, Le Pierre Steatit in East Broughton. And I helped that young man, a second generation, trained him to build heaters, and he now has his own line of kits that he makes. Sold mostly in Canada, but he's a very good soapstone stove builder. I want to say one other thing about the soapstone. For the longest time, the soapstone heaters were being made with soapstone as the firebox. Rod mentioned that soapstone has a little bit of molecular water locked up in it. And when the Finns came to Brazil and bought the soapstone quarry in Brazil, which I helped them make a connection on, they were very worried that the workmen in Virginia wouldn't remember to cut the soapstone in the correct direction. So if you take a 2x4, it has an end grain, and at the end of the 2x4, that you can see the pores. And so they said, whenever you make the fire brick for the soapstone firebox, you have to have the end grain to the fire so that when it gets really hot, that water molecule that's going to come out can come out without spalling the face of the soapstone. So that was really important to them. And they did figure out how to do that. But soapstone doesn't have the long life or easy repairability in the Firebox. And eventually, with only 10,000 units a year, they realized it was going to be smart to make a different Firebox. So today, I think just like the picture that Rod showed, if people remember, it was a ceramic or a refractory brick lining. And they invented a liner system with a hollow wall behind it. Remember the solo stove where the double wall construction with a void where that preheated air can come up and then come in over the fire. So in the new Firebox of the standard Tuulikivi line, it's a replaceable liner system made out of ceramic blonde brick that are hollow on the back like waffle lines. And so air comes in under the fire to get it started. But once the fire is started, the air comes in outside the walls between the soapstone walls and the liner walls, and then it's introduced over the fire, and it's called the Whirlwind Firebox. It was actually patented by two people, one of whom was my now deceased longtime friend Heikki Hyutiainen that I worked with for probably 40 years in Finland. So that's now a standard process, is figuring out a way to get the air over the fire. And we've done our own system of that with different channels and things. And I've recently, I've only done a handful of these, but I'm kind of excited about it. I've created a replaceable element that comes in as a stainless steel T-section that runs up the inside of the walls and introduces air over the fire. So there's lots of ways to skin that cat, but that's the way to do it to make things burn clean.
So I've got a couple of questions, because a lot of us here in this group are building high performance or relatively high performance houses. How much do these masonry heaters output? I know, Rod, you showed some of those the Klein versions, the smaller versions. You know, how much is the output from those on an hourly basis?
They can be done with 1 kilowatt, which is basically 3,500 BTUs.
That's pretty small.
There's a significant shift that's happening. When we were introduced, Michael said that Albie would talk about some of the stuff he saw in Europe. And we were surprised that when you tour the factory today, they start showing you some very much smaller units. And we did a build in a house, and the house was quite modest. And they explained to us, one of the things I was thrilled with, by the way, that the stone was all there when we got there. It was all laid out in a certain order. And I said, who did this? And they said, oh, well, when we sell a stove in Finland, the homeowner has to bring in all the stone and lay it out and prepare the site for the mason. I said, I love that system. So there were like, I don't know, 10 of us plus the 2 gifted masons. And we were told to stand back and let the gifted masons do the work because we weren't supposed to touch anything. But those masons couldn't have cared less. They wanted us to participate. But what was fascinating about the stove, they told us about the house first, and they said, in the last 10 years, you can figure this out whether it's true or not. They said our energy efficiency in these homes has increased tenfold, which is just remarkable. So the Finns are not going to give up the love of the fire or the love of the radiant mass, but what they're giving up in these very modest homes, which are not cheap, they're super insulated, they're the high performance homes that Ben is talking about. So in a very modest living dining space was a stove maybe 32, 35 inches across and maybe 2 feet deep, maybe 5 feet tall. And it, instead of being a 60 millimeter, 2 3/8 inches thick wall with a liner of 30 millimeters, another 1.25 inches, let's say, instead of that being the heat exchange veneer, the veneer was only 40 millimeters thick. So it was, and then there was a 30 millimeter gap between that wall and the next wall, which defined the whole core of the system inside of which was this ceramic fire tube. In any case, that unit was backed right up against the wall, within 30 millimeters of the wall, like 1.5 inches away from the wall. And we were all kind of, impressed by it. There was no shield, but in that gap between the back wall of the veneer and the wall of the core, there was a 30 millimeter gap. And on that wall, towards the combustible wall, there was a 30 millimeter sheet of mineral wool being installed in there. It's not that there wasn't going to be any heat coming off, but it was going to be a very little heat and very slow heat. On the right side of the unit, again with the same gap on the right as on the left, the right side was going to come up close to a counter. And so again, on that side, where the clearance was very, very minimal, there was a 30 millimeter sheet of insulation put between the two walls. So those were going to be very low output walls. The front face and the left face, which were both open for the living area, didn't have the insulation in them. Those were going to be a slower heat release, but they weren't going to be slowed down by additional insulation. Well, that was one surprise. And they said, did you know, and I can't remember whether it was 30% or 50%. They said now 30, take your choice. 30% is a lot. It might have been 50. It might have been 40. That quantity of their sales now in Central Europe is like relative to that little heater that Rod showed you. They said these are now starting to dominate our sales. People are building these super insulated homes, smaller spaces. They still want the mass. They want the quality of the heat. They want to see the fire. They want it to be a clean burn. But the big heaters that we built traditionally in poorly insulated homes aren't going to work. Americans are still building crazy big houses. So they're going to need that bigger heater. But for the more efficient home, no. One of the fellows went next door, and this was a development. And he said, she had a wood pile out back that was undercover. And he asked her how much wood they were burning. And I'm sure the quantity of wood that she reported, I can't remember the exact amount, but it was probably certainly less than a quart of wood for the whole winter. My son has a 3,000 plus square foot home on a ridge in Maine, very well insulated. And I built a heater for him with brick, and he has radiant floor heating as backup, but they do one fire a day and they burn for 3,000 plus square feet, less than 3 cords a year. It always stuns him about how little wood he's burning and how clean it is. So there is this marked change in the demand in Europe, and I think America's lagging behind, but we're getting there. And the other thing, the technology which kind of blew us away was they haven't sat on their hands wondering what's really going on here. They have a brilliant young engineer, and he spent 3 years charged with the idea of coming up with something that would calculate the chimney draft automatically, would calculate the wood, would calculate the conditions of the day. And underneath the firebox is an ash drawer, and underneath the ash drawer is the equivalent of, your little stereo set that was about 12 inches wide and 3 inches high and 8 inches deep. And that is all now available as a insert where you can choose to control all the combustion yourself, or you can sit there with your phone and press a button and say, okay, guys, go on automatic now and give us the optimal performance with all of the understanding that's built into the brains of the system. And so we sat in a big greeting room with one of these 7-foot tall heaters, and there on the bottom face of it was this series of lights like on your internet or receiver, where the blue lights come on and tell you whether you're getting a signal or not. And there were five lights that could come on, and they would start yellow and go to orange and then go to red and then go to white. And by the time the burn was underway, we had 5 white lights across the bottom. which was telling you as the user that you had achieved maximum efficiency and you didn't have to do anything now except watch. And so that's now being offered as a foolproof system. And you say, well, what do you do if you lose power? And you say, all the controls are there. You just step in and use the controls. So we were very impressed by that they are not sitting on their hands and saying, this is what we do. There's constant innovation in the whole European world of masonry heaters. There's constant innovation to make things better and better. And I think that's true here too, but it's not funded by people with megabucks. It's funded by people like Rod and me, which do this by the seat of our pants.
Yeah, no, that's or that's all fascinating. Yeah, just or a friend of mine has said, like, we developed from cavemen with fire, like, just looking at fire is in our DNA. So it makes it's great that as our building technologies evolve, we can keep maximizing its potential. How important is the firewood species and dryness and preparation, splitting, size? Just how important is that for sort of the traditional masonry heaters, and then these high performance, let's call them high performance masonry heaters? How important is the wood preparation? Maybe do you have an answer, Rod?
Firewood, you can burn any wood as long as it's dry. The amount of BTUs is the same per pound. Hardwood will have more BTUs and less mass. Softwood is fine to burn as long as it's dry in a masonry heater, because you're not choking it down and having it smolder, so that you've got complete combustion. The wood does need to be split to a smaller cross section, because you're not trying to have the fire last and smolder for 10 hours or all day or all night. You do want it to burn out in approximately an hour and a half. So a cross section of about 4 inches across split is optimal. You can also burn their bio bricks or compressed brick sawdust logs. They also work well in masonry heaters. You can mix it, a little of that with cordwood. It just helps. It does burn a little. Cordwood does burn better than this compressed sawdust does.
I have a question. I got to jump in. I got so many questions. There's so many questions in the chat. So earlier, one of you mentioned about doing hot water as part of it. And I'm curious if hot water only works kind of in the older traditional stoves where you have more space, or we're always looking for the best, most efficient thing. Are the smaller stoves, would that have any ability to do hot water as well? And then somebody else asked about hydronic distribution, but I'm assuming that sort of goes against the really great nature of the masonry heater being a radiant source. But hot water, can anybody talk a little bit about how to combine hot water and masonry heaters?
I can. Tula Kiwi offered hot water systems and advertised them here. I had a client that wanted it. We purchased it. It was installed over the top of a bake oven, so it was a huge stainless steel tank. And they didn't have translated instructions, so I actually went to the Finnish consulate and had them translate it, and then had Tula Kiwi pay for it. The plumber then looked at it, and there was a fitting that was not threaded, and well, he threaded it, and then he finally says, I'm not hooking this thing up, because if you hook that up and you've got a fire burning, you can't control the fire, you can't turn the fire off, and the power goes off, you've got a bomb that's going to explode. And the water systems in Europe are done very differently, where they're not pressurized. You can do them a water system that's safe in North America, but it would have to be engineered and tested. And there aren't any of them that have done that I'm aware of. There are plenty of people that bend their own stainless steel pipe, put copper tubing in the firebox or around the firebox. And you can also do a research on Google and look for hot water systems for wood stoves. And you'll find all kinds of photographs and descriptions of people exploding their stoves or blowing the pipes apart. So they brazed them together and then they fired it up again. And he had a geyser coming out of the top of his well outside.
I have a story. I did a heater for a couple in Adirondack, New York years ago, and they were living in their basement. They were groundhogs, and they bought an old barn frame and built the barn frame. And then we designed together and built a heater, and they traveled all over the state with their little pickup truck picking up stones. And I gave them some big stones for benches. And so they built their own first heater veneer around a core that we built together. But then they started taking vacations. They became very successful making Adirondack furniture and lighting. And they fell in love with Yellowstone, and they bought a property out there along the Yellowstone River. Thankfully, they didn't get washed out in the last flood. And they built a gorgeous heater out there with a home with no windows really. It was a gallery and a home. No windows really towards the road as it comes into Gardner, Montana, where the entrance to the park is. But they had 10-foot tall windows looking out over the park and over the Yellowstone River. And she said, John, Cheryl said to John, she said, you have to raise it higher. I can't see the mountains until we get a taller ceiling. So they have these big, big windows. And I went out, and again, we built another core together, and they had found some split limestone pieces that they were going to use as a veneer. Understand, these are incredible artists. So they went ahead and did a beautiful veneer. That was the heater for the house. They did their own passive solar hydronic domestic hot water system on the roof. And they said, Albie, we want to make some hot water here from the heater in the winter when the sun may not give us what we need on the roof. And I said, my suggestion is don't put any water jackets near the fire because that's going to lower the combustion temperature of the fire. Put it someplace where there's not a risk of overpressure or anything, and where there's a surplus of heat. So they made, under my suggestions, a stainless steel pan. Imagine a huge cookie sheet with high rim around it. And above the capping slabs inside the system, they put a manifold of copper or stainless pipe. I did not design it or build it. Worked with their solar designer, and that heat that was after the fire has done what it needs to do, after it's burned the gases, there is a lot of stored heat in those 3.5-inch thick refractory capping slabs. So up there in a bed of marbles or ball bearings or whatever it was, surrounding the pipes, the manifold of pipes, like a ladder system or serpentine system, they had it linked to their roof system. Understanding, as Rod said, is all of this is figured out so it's not under high pressure. It's got all the correct valves. It's designed with a plumber and so forth and so on. And they've had very, very good luck with that, doing domestic hot water without any fossil fuel or electric backup between the heater and the solar. In general, I discourage people from trying to do anything more than doing a boost to domestic hot water. It's an error to think that you're trying to create a hydronic boiler out of a masonry heater. It's going in the opposite direction, and you're going to be in trouble. And as Rod said, in Europe, things are atmospheric vented. If you go into your toilet and lift the top off your toilet and look at the water, there's no pressure there. It's coming in under pressure, but that is a atmospheric vented chamber. And so if you can figure out a way to create a chamber that doesn't have any pressure as an issue, then you're on the right track. I can remember, can I tell one more story?
I haven't known you not to, Albie.
Yeah. So a couple approached me years ago in New Hampshire, and they were building a vacation home. They had met some young carpenters that were learning Japanese joinery, and they were going to build a Japanese style home. Everything was plain, nothing was sanded, and it was going to be their retreat from Boston. And when they left, there would be no pressure, no heat, no nothing in the house. They said, can you design a heater for us that we can cook and bake and heat from? But we'd also like you to make the hot water. And when we leave, we need to drain it all down. And so I wound up getting a 1,200-gallon recycled bulk milk storage tank that had lost its refrigeration elements. I had it patched. We had it replumbed so that it could go underground. They were getting water off their roof to fill the tank. When they arrived, they would use a long-handled pump next to their sink, and they would pump up water to a series of two 30-gallon copper tanks, one on the first level above and one on the second level above. On the back of the stove, I had them build, I had a friend design a copper toilet tank equivalent, and we hung that on the back of the stove. So the minute they got there, the first thing they did was light their stove, go to the water, go to the sink, and pump 5 gallons of water and put it in that tank on the back of the stove. So they were heating water as soon as they were starting the unit. They were then filling 60 gallons of water into both of the copper tanks. The top tank was the refill tank. The next tank was the heating tank. And so whenever they wanted hot water after that first round, all they had to do was, it was a gravity flow from the first tank down to their shower or to their sink. And then all they had to do was count on the second tank to refill the first tank. And as they used it, they would just pump more water up to the second tank. And then they said, okay, it's time to leave. And all they had to do was pull the plug and it all flowed out. So that system worked great. And a couple other people have tried that and that's worked great. But this is stuff that has to be taken with great, great seriousness. It is not something that can be put in and just you turn your back and walk away. Because if there's heat in the system and there's no way for it to release and you lose power and the pump isn't working, you're in deep trouble. So that needs to be studied. It's possible to do things, but it has to be studied very carefully.
Got it.
I wanted to jump in again too. I just saw this pop up in the comments and I thought it would be great. Somebody asked about talking about the cost. So can you guys give a window of like bargain basement prefab? You're going to do it, small, energy efficient version to the stoves to some of the beautiful soapstones with the beautiful benches that you've done. Like, what's the range in masonry heaters for, people who want to try it out?
Well, I designed and built a masonry heater that was inside of two 55-gallon steel drums. They're recycled. They was for the Washington, D.C. Green Wood Stove Design Challenge. Ben actually saw that where I had it painted at a auto shop.
It's where Rod and I met. I saw a crazy guy with some wood burning contraption made out of barrels on the back of his trailer, and I had to find out what it was.
You're like, oh, what's this?
Yeah, like a moth to a flame.
It actually had the lowest emissions of any stove down there that they tested, other than a university team that had all kinds of electronics monitoring and then controlling the combustion. That could be built with, if it's all a question of how much do you know, what tools do you have, what knowledge do you have, what materials do you have. That stove was my idea of a low-cost stove that could be built completely with recycled materials, because you can use brick, use fire brick. It had air injection around it. That's, to me, for a masonry heater would be the low cost version. Actually, steel skin stoves were done in Europe and in the Scandinavian countries going back 100 years or more. And I think there's some new ones that are out there now. And then it's a question of, you mentioned basements. If basements generally are not insulated, so having a radiant heat source in a basement is not, it's going to heat the walls and the floor, but it's not going to, the heat just keeps right on going into the ground and doesn't heat the house. It's not like putting a metal wood stove in the basement where you have a lot of excess heat and it radiates up through the floor and with hot air vents. So that, for me, it's like, where are you actually doing your living? And, I'd like to have something that's beautiful as well as functional. And the cost of it you can spend $50,000 on a stove, if someone else is building it for you, depending upon what the surface material is and the features are. There are low-cost units. I don't have numbers in the top of my head to respond to that accurately.
I'd like to respond to the cost question too. Years ago, we were asked to, a couple had moved down from Canada and joined a radiology practice near Augusta. And they bought a big log home and they were going to gut it and tear out the floors and tear out the partitions and tear down the stone chimney and throw away the fireplace and start over. They hired us and we did all of that and tore out the footing, did a new footing, came back up with a new foundation, filled their basement garage with tens of thousands of pounds of split cutoffs from the Le Pierre quarry. And we transformed that into course after course of split face, hand cut soapstone around one of our cores with heated benches. And then that part was finished and we started the chimney. And I said, well, now, normally people shift now to a brick or block chimney with stucco on it to save money. And they said, well, actually, we like what you're doing very much. And would you please continue the soapstone through the cathedral ceiling all the way to the roof? And I said, okay, but that's going to cost more than the veneer of your heater at $100 a square foot. And they said, no, we really like it. So I did that. We got to the roof in the middle of the winter. We built a heated hut up there and they said, we want a stone veneer above the roof too. That was done with granite cobblestones around a block chimney. And we capped it and finished it. And that project came in at over $100,000. It would be more today. I remember building a very elegant, huge project for a family in Pittsfield, Maine. And I got very nervous about the cost, which was coming in at around $40,000. It would be way more than that today. And I spoke to the guy putting in the stereo system. I said, how much is this stereo system going to cost? Anyway, he said, oh, we're at 40,000 now. And I said, okay, I guess I'm going to stop worrying about what the heater is going to cost. So over the years, I tried like Rod to come up with, because I got into this with the idea that it was an everyman thing, not an elite thing. And it turns out that what pays the bills are people who have some money. But there are ways for owner builders. I've been teaching hands-on workshops for 40 years. And I teach people how to build their own units. They can use my core, they can do something else. But there is a way for somebody to start with decent hand skills, which I call a craftsman's attitude. You don't have to be a mason, you have to have a craftsman attitude. And if you have time, you can build your own good heater for way less money than paying somebody. But I started playing with the largest masonry element that I could find that was readily available all over the country. And it turns out it's a clay flue tile. The rectangular clay flue tiles, the largest ones you can buy, made in the Midwest, are 2 feet square by 2 feet tall. And they're about 2.5 inches thick. And if you put heat in them, they're going to crack. So we would cut them up the middle and then bind them back together with a gasket. And we would stack them 2 tall or 3 tall. And then we would build a fire brick core inside of them. And people would look at it and they'd say, well, that's heating, but what are you going to cover it with? And I said, you don't like the look of brown clay with round corners? You can cover it if you want. But the whole idea here was to give you an aesthetic which was pleasing at a reasonable cost. We did a bunch of those. They never flew off the production line, but I did a bunch of this. And The smallest one, which I'm really proud of, and we only did a handful of those, was for a cottage heater. And I wanted to build something that I could feel really good about, that was clean burning, that could heat, that could cook, and could take care of a space, a very, very small space. And so I designed a one-tile heater. And I worked with my son, Scott, and had him fabricate a steel cap with expansion joints in it so the steel wouldn't warp. And I don't know if any of you folks remember, in the early days of wood heat, there was a stove. What was it called? Geez, I'm forgetting. Rod might remember. The temp cast. No, the temp cast is a masonry heater. Anyway, it was all steel construction, and it introduced the air through the top, through tubes that went down about 6 inches into the fire. And the fire itself at the bottom was lined with 1.25 inch fire brick. So you had a refractory firebox with all the air coming in over the top. And the fire was loaded through a round lid in the top. So it cost like $350 for this. I have one still up in a cabin in the North Woods. And I said, that air tube delivery system is a really good idea. So with my one-tile heater, I designed a one-tile stove, split in half, lined with full fire brick. That gives us a wall now that's 6.5 inches thick of mass. I take a second tile, I cut it in half, turn it upside down like a lowercase n, and I put it under the 2 tiles that are joined together with a gasket and some strapping with the cooktop lid on it. Now we're up to 3 feet countertop height. Air is coming through the top with a regulatable 2 tubes coming down in the inside corners. And lo and behold, for 10 or 15 pounds of wood, they're cooking their meal. And in a tiny house, and I'm talking 400 square feet or so, they're heating that cabin with like a 3 or 4 inch clearance to the wall. They're cooking, and guess what? In the morning, that 7 inches of masonry is still heating that space. So the concept of how to do something for not a lot of money is out there. The rocket stove people have done a lot of work on that. And the one-tile heater is just an example of how one person, scratching his head for 47 years, said, how can I build a little heater that's really clean and really functional for a really small space that doesn't cost a fortune, that anybody can build? That's what I did. But for the average client, I'm building something that's $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 before it's all done. And for the wealthy client, it's up to 100 or more. But these are people that would have put a useless monster in the middle of the house that they would have paid the same amount of money for, and it never would have given them anything in terms of performance. So what do you do?
To this day, my dream home is a pretty good envelope with a masonry heater in the middle of it. One side of it's to the living room, one side is to the kitchen with a cook stove, and some coat racks on one side where I can hang my coats in the winter. And I want to build it myself. I've been thinking about doing this for about 15 years, and maybe in another 15 years I'll get there.
You need to sign up with Rod as an apprentice, or come see me for a hands-on build, and you'll learn everything you need to know in terms of ideas in a week or two, and then we can coach you from a distance. It's all about, only one person can only do so much, and this concept doesn't survive unless a lot of people are doing it. And the whole idea is to get the knowledge spread. And my hope before I die is to get all of what I've done documented and given away so that people can see it.
It's an admirable goal.
Where are you, Ben?
I'm in Connecticut. I'm just probably about 45 minutes south of Rod.
Yeah, you need to start hanging out at his doorstep.
Yeah, or after that eloquent piece, I have a more utilitarian question. Maybe Rod can answer. Early in your presentation, you said the heaters had something X efficiency. I don't remember if you said 70, 80, 90% efficient. So I'm curious how is efficiency measured? And then related question is, are masonry heaters rated for particulate emissions like the EPA caps wood stoves at 2.5 grams per hour of 2.5 micron emissions. Are there any of those sorts of regulations on masonry heaters in Europe or the US?
I've masonry heaters that I design with the calculation systems from the Kakalov and Verbond, they have a minimum requirement of 73% efficiency. Now that I believe is I get confused. There's a lower and higher heat value. Europe does the higher heat value. The US does the lower heat value. There is the tax credits that are available with 75% lower heat value in the US, which converts to about 83% higher heat value like it's done in Europe. The stoves, I've built stoves that have been 93, 95% efficiency, higher heat value. Some of the kit units are in that same efficiency value. You had a couple other questions there that I'm not remembering as I'm talking.
Or just particulate emissions, are they rated for
particulate emissions? We worked with EPA. We were exempted in the initial NSPS, which is New Source Performance Standard by EPA back in the 80s, I believe it was. They said, well, we should have a alternative way to be listed and approved. They gave us that was to the MHA. They gave those requirements to the MHA. We fulfilled all of those requirements. We never got the approval. There was the second NSPA, which I was involved with HPBA and meeting many, many times with EPA and ASTM with the explicit asking EPA to regulate us. And they kept saying yes and yes and yes until they finally gave the final draft of what it was, and we were exempted. Which the problem with that is that then you have local jurisdictions that are saying only wood burning appliances that are EPA approved are allowed to be installed. If you're not if you can't be approved, you can't install it.
Right.
Then there are local jurisdictions and states that are having their own testing method. So you have to have a Colorado approved tested masonry heater or a Washington state approved test. It's not an EPA approved test, but another one that actually the person that created it is no longer in business. So you can't even get you can't even have the test done.
Right. Or anecdotally, when we were chatting on the phone for our pregame, you guys said when the stove, like aside from an initial little puff of smoke when the chimney's heating up, once it's warm, you don't actually see any emissions, which is true for my Lopi Endeavor wood stove, which is rated for, I think, 1.4 grams per hour. Once it's warmed up, you don't see any emissions. So just I have to imagine if the smoke is invisible, then the emissions are probably pretty good.
Well, that's true, except that the amount of wood that you're burning in that metal stove is much more than what you need to heat the house, because yes, they're clean. It is clean burning, but the heat's going right up the chimney.
Right.
You do get some radiant heat from the body of the stove, but the body of the stove can also only radiate so much and have it comfortable. If you're getting very good efficiency out of the combustion and the radiant into the house, and you're burning 20 pounds of wood, you're going to have the stove cherry red.
Right.
And the stove then is emitting positive ions, which are negative to your health environment. A low temperature masonry heater emits negative ions, which is the same as going out under a pine tree. The pine trees emit negative ions. That's why it feels good to be there. And they've tested health benefits for arthritis in your heart and circulation systems in Austria, and this is all documented. If you need to find that.
Oh, wow. Or well, I have an old farmhouse not far from Albie with 3 fireplaces we don't use. So just my dream is to eventually get him to make us a really sweet masonry oven and cook oven.
So I've actually 50% of my work is retrofit to existing homes.
Is it?
And sometimes there is an existing masonry fireplace, and I've gutted the fireplace, relined the chimney properly sized with an insulated liner, and can build the firebox into the location of where the firebox was, and then have the heat exchange channels sitting out basically on the hearth, so that you're not taking up a lot of room space to accomplish that.
Yeah, nice.
Hey, I have a story. Only one.
Okay, we are at the end of our official show, so it's going to be somewhat quick, but
I had a couple from Quebec come years ago, and they said, we want to build a masonry heater. We have no money. And I said, great, let's figure out how to do this. I said, go to the dump, try to find some old stoves that have been thrown away, salvage the hardware, keep scrounging until you find brick and fire brick used, and pay as little as you can for it. And here are all the plans. I'm giving you the plans. And about a month or 2 or 3 later, they sent me these color photographs with these big grins of this masonry heater they had built at basically no cost. So if somebody has a passion and wants to do it, I'm not standing in their way. I'm trying to figure out a way to give them the knowledge and the information and access to something where they can fulfill that dream.
Well said.
excellent. And I will post you both your websites once again in the chat. We've done it a couple of times now, so.
Yeah, this was great. Thank you both for sharing tonight. Now I think like 50% of the audience wants to go out and build a masonry heater for sure. I posted in there, you guys need to do like a summer camp. I think you could get some takers for sure.
Sign me up.
Sign me
Rod, I
up.
may be sitting on your doorstep here in a day or two, so it was Albie's idea. You can blame him.
You're welcome anytime. I've got a complete stone shop and wet saw and materials.
Nice.
Excellent. Or well, thank you guys and our audience and everybody else. This was a great conversation. Really interesting stuff.
Thank you very much for the chance to chat with you.
Absolutely.
Thank you. It's been delightful.
Thanks
Good
so
night,
much,
all.
gentlemen. Have a great night.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.